Okay, hello. Welcome to this live stream with Joranalogue audio design. I will first of all say hello. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine.
Good. So we wanted to do this live stream based around the filter rate, which I've done the video demo for, but I've certainly got some questions about your background a little bit as well. We might probe into what's to come. You don't have to give away any secrets or anything. But I'll straight away kind of open it up to the live chat and just make sure everyone's aware that any questions you want to ask, I'll either interject or I'll take note and we'll ask them as we go. If you're watching this not live, just on YouTube, ask any questions in the comments and I'll either pass them on if I can't answer or I'll answer the questions. So we'll start with kind of some history and background. What got you into modular to start with, either as a user or as a designer?
That's really
big question.
It's one of those things that sort of happened, you know. I got into electronic music, and then I got interested into. I mean, I was always interested in technology, and then I got into electronics, and then the electronic music and the electronics and the synthesizers, everything intersected. And then I discovered modular stuff, and it just somehow clicked with me, just the whole modular approach.
So before that then, it's kind of easy to just we stumble into this, you know, you maybe play a guitar or use a laptop or other synths or keyboards, and then all of a sudden some modules, you know, they've caught your attention. Yeah. What were you doing before modular? Were you in a computer? Were you using any other hardware? What were you kind of drawn to before that, I guess?
Well, my first synth was a microcorg, which I still have. And I mean, it was the first synth for a lot of people, I think, and still criminally underrated, I think. I mean, it's pretty decent. And then somehow, yeah, I stumbled upon this modular thing, and I just absorbed all knowledge I could find about it. Long years before I had a system of my own. I started designing modules before I had any of them. So yeah, I can't really put it into words, but it's one of those things you find and it somehow clicks in your head, like, okay, this makes sense to do it this way.
So with you saying you were designing modules before you had a system, yeah. What enabled you to do that? Did you have some engineering, you know, as part of a day job, or as your background, or were you just dreaming up ideas of what a synth could be, or what were those early kind of designs like?
Yeah, so this was like almost 10 years ago, so I was still in high school. And yeah, just looking at what exists, and really this was just before Eurorack got really big.
Yeah.
So throughout the years, I've seen some things go by which are kind of similar to things I've thought about years ago. So that's always interesting to see. But yeah, just looking at circuits and seeing like how can these be used musically. Looking at vintage stuff and seeing like, okay, how can we bring this into a modular context? Yeah, lots of these strange little ideas, and most of them never got anywhere. But some of my current modules are still inspired by those early designs. So yeah.
One thing, I mean, diving into the current product line, I'll pull up the image from the website, and I'll put links to all these things in the description as well. Each module to me seems quite simple, but goes way beyond what you kind of expect it to do. So for example, the mix free, you look at it without reading anything, and all right, there's more jacks at the bottom, so you might question it to some degree, but you think, oh, it's a free channel mixer. But then you realize that you've actually got CV inputs for the channels. You've got the extra unity input, the D input at the bottom right. And then you've also got the master level as well. So straight away it's like, well, actually it's a load of VCAs, and there's the master level control, which I think in a little video I made for this back around the 12 days of Divmas thing I did months ago near Christmas, I used it as a sidechain so that I could VCA modulate the 3 channels, but then kind of master sidechain control the whole thing as a submix. And I thought in the amount of space, it was really clever. And I think all the other designs are the same. Compare to, for example, you see dual window comparator, and certainly just speaking for myself, I thought, okay, you know, I kind of get what a comparator does, but there's seemingly more going on. And then it wasn't until I tried it that I and read the manual as well, which was great, how much there is on offer to that thing. And I tried my best to get it all in the demo that I did for that one. What kind of leads you to these designs that push kind of beyond the basics, if you like? It would be easy just to build a basic comparator or a basic mixer or a standard triple VCA or something. What kind of leads you to take these things further?
Well, the way I design my modules can differ a lot, and Mix 3 and Compare 2 are nice examples because they were both designed with a different mindset, let's say. So Compare 2 is one of those designs which was derived from my earlier ideas about modular. So we're talking about, I don't know, 7 years ago or something. And the window comparator circuit has several applications in general electronics. For example, you could use them in a test system, like you have power supplies, you want to test if the output voltages are correct. But I realized that comparators are used in modular systems, but not window comparators. So I built it up and I discovered, like, okay, this actually can have a lot of musical applications. So it's really just looking at general electronic circuits and seeing how can these be used in a musical context. So yeah, that was then part of a also 8 HP module, but it had one window comparator, and it was actually like half of Compare 2 and half of Select 2 together in one module, which is a lot less exciting than it sounds. So yeah, so I decided to just split them up, and this way you just have way more versatility, way more options. So yeah, and of course things have changed. Select 2 especially is a lot different than it was in that early design. And then Mix 3 is very different. So Mix 3 is relatively recent, like 2 years or something, when the concept first appeared. And I was using a system by a friend and tester, and he had a lot of these little mixer modules, but none of them had LEDs. So so it was all patched up, and I had no clue what was going where, and I had to follow cables everywhere, and it just drove me mad. So I went, okay, what kind of small mixer modules do we have with LEDs on the market? Not a lot. There are a few more now that appeared in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
But then, okay, so I went, let's design one. Put LEDs on the channels, and you know, why not add VCAs as well? Because I'm also interested in small systems. So you'll notice my modules are quite compact. So I like to put a lot of versatility in a small form factor. And this allows you to make small systems like 42 HP or something, which still have a lot of possibilities. Because I see that's a trend that people also are moving towards, small systems, travel systems. So I think that's really interesting evolution.
Yeah, I mean, the thing specifically with Mix 3 that I find more exciting is that it's, you know, we've got other VCAs, and there's lots of quad VCAs that are slightly bigger, There's some smaller mixers that are just mixers, but it's that ability to actually kind of sculpt the sound itself. I found that I'd make my own snare drums just because I had the option to CV everything. So I'd put, snare drum, or just put noise into channel A, and then get a nice exponential envelope in. I then might do the same with some filtered audio, filtered noise for some hi-hats or some other percussion. But then because there was that additional D input to chain either a second mix free or another mixer or something else into it, maybe a bass drum sound that's already just created somewhere else, and then be able to control the level itself, you could envelope follow the output and then patch that into the level and get compression type effects. It led in a small space to lots of, well, fun and quite unique things, rather than thinking, I need VCAs, I need a mixer, I need another mixer to chain to this one to sum my inputs together. And it's not cramped either. You mentioned, trends moving towards smaller systems. And I see these, nice mixtures in people's performance cases of either 2 or 3 HP modules, and they're dotted around the bigger stuff. Yeah. But this isn't cramped in any way.
Yeah.
There's 9 jacks at the bottom, but they're not that close. It doesn't feel cramped. It's not hard to get a jack in or out, even when they're all plugged in. It still feels kind of performance friendly with the knobs. It's not covered in mini pots and anything else. So yeah, and that's kind of the main thing I wanted to say, that the whole lineup seems to have just taken everything much further. I'm glad you mentioned Select 2 as well, because again, it's very easy to look and think, oh, it's just a basic CV processor, attenuation, inversion, 2 channels. But things like having the hold input so that you could freeze and hold the voltage, be it audio or CV, the fact that you could gate on and off a unity level, which wasn't a unit. When I first saw it, I thought that was a unity input.
Yeah.
But the fact that you could gate on and off the amount of attenuation, I think that's the first time I've seen that anywhere.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, I mean, you could patch it up with some gated switching, and yeah, but just to have it in a module like this. Yeah, and again, the idea with Select 2 was just you have a lot of these like utilities, I guess, these little functions you need in a system.
Yeah.
And usually you would just like, okay, I have one of those modules and one of those, and I have a gated switch module, and I have a track and hold module. And before you know it, you have all these little 4 HP things, and it adds up to, I don't know, like 16 HP total.
Yeah.
And why not just put all those little extra functions you need in a small module, and they're always ready for use, so you can just use it. Sometimes I just use it to generate an offset or attenuate something. And in other patches, it can be like a modulation hub, and you switch between things and you hold them and you use everything at once. And it doesn't matter, you just have all the options and you use what you need for a certain patch.
Well, just that, like you said, you might just use it as an offset generator, but the fact that you can gate on and off unity, it's as if you've got a spare VCA to turn either itself off or anything else.
It's like a really simple VCA with 2 settings, I guess.
Yeah. It's on or it's off, but it's still it's clever, and it pushes kind of way beyond anything else. Which leads us really nicely to Filter 8, which we do have a question about already, which I'll just ask before we move on. It's a nice kind of opening question for the filter. Faction 1973 asked, what are your favorite filters and what was their influence on the Filter 8? I thought that was a nice question.
Yeah. Geez, filters are one of those things, you have a lot of flavors, I guess, in filters, more so than in any other module. Because oscillators, okay, you have some different kinds, but they all tend to end up making saw waves and square waves and stuff.
Yeah.
But filters are really something which can make a huge difference. And especially on vintage synthesizers, like 90% of the character comes from the filter, I feel.
Yeah, I'd agree.
So they're really essential, I think. And I tend to like a lot of different kind of filters, so it's hard to say like what's your favorite filter. It kind of depends on what you're looking for in a certain sound or in a certain situation. So I like these really odd filters like the Polyvox and the Steiner Parker is a really old favorite of mine, or the Wasp filter, and I like them sonically, but I also like them electronically because they have these quirks about them. Like the Wasp filter, it uses digital ICs in an analog way, which is odd, and the Polyvox uses this programmable op-amp, old Soviet parts, and somehow manages to create a filter without using capacitors, so that's really odd as well. And then the Steiner Parker, which is just a beautiful, it's basically a Allen key filter, but with a string of diodes used as variable resistors. So just really clever circuits. But I also like these, like the transistor filters, both the ladder filters, both transistor and diodes. I like all filters basically. So all the OTA filters you find in these old Roland synths, they all have their interesting bits. MS-20, yeah. MS-20 is also both versions, because there are two versions. You have the Core 35 and then the later OTA filter, and they're completely different. So yeah, I like all filters, I guess.
It's really, I think we all go through a kind of filter junkie stage where, you know, you start with whichever one draws your attention at the time, be it the kind of smooth 24 dB Moog ladder, or you know, you like a 303, so you prefer the diode thing, or whatever it is you stumble into. And like you said, because in those classic synths, a kind of classic subtractive thing, so much of the character is based around that filter. It's really easy to get 2 or 3 and feel like everything sounds quite different when you're patching with the same oscillators, same envelopes for a while. I can see that. I think we are starting to see wave folders kind of branch out a little bit more. Yeah. There's been quite a few recently, but yeah, filters, I think, definitely the biggest thing. And I think it's why so many of us end up with quite a lot of them. And, you know, maybe then try and scale them back, I don't know. But the Filter 8, I can't really place its character. I can't say, oh, well, it's this one, or you're clearly most influenced by this topology or this flavor, or it's kind of tricky to pin down. Did you have a goal in mind for the actual tone of it, regardless of the actual features? When you started designing it, was there I want this to be like this vintage synth, or this particular design? Was there one that spoke to you more than others, or were you kind of trying to be a bit more open than that?
Well, I find that most filters, well, if you have a theoretical filter, if all VCFs would be theoretical perfect filters, they would all sound the same. So I found that, okay, they all introduce these little quirks, like they have some distortion in the feedback in the resonance path, or they have some poles interacting, like a lot of the ladder filters. And this is why they all sound different, because they're not perfect, basically. I found that an alternative approach to filter character is to make a filter which is basically as close to perfect as you can, I guess, an analog, but introduce a lot of modulation options. And this allows users to use the modulation to like patch their own character, basically. So you use the frequency modulation, you use the hold, you use the different outputs, you combine them. So you get, I like to think of it as a whole different way of a different approach to filters. Instead of looking at, okay, I like the sound of that filter or I like the sound of that filter, you just have one filter which you can use and program the way you want it to be. That's sort of the idea behind filter rate.
Yeah, that's kind of my take on it as well. I think it can be, certainly not always, because you can patch it with both the inputs in use, but it's quite a clean filter to start with. It almost had a slightly Roland-ish tone to it. When you just, plug a single wave in, envelope to the cutoff, exponential FM input, medium-ish resonance, it's kind of in that nice, cleaner, not that dissimilar to my SH09, but again, not quite that character, but more that than Polyvox or Moog style or anything else.
It's also closest in topology to those Roland filters. So it's an OTA filter basically, but using VCA chips which have lower distortion. There are a few other filters in Eurorack which use the same approach, so it's not super unique in that regard.
Yeah, which would make sense. But when you hear the 24 dB, because you've got all 1 to 4 poles of low pass, 6 dB per octave, 12, 18, 24, it then starts to sound more unique because none of those Roland filters are 24 dB per octave slopes. So it then starts to be a bit more, not that the sound is not unique because it isn't just a straight clone of anything, but it then starts to be quite different. And then when you use both inputs and you're really hitting the input stage and it's saturating, that's a different saturation to say the Wasp or the Polyvox. I guess it's saturating at a different point in the circuit because you get a very different response. The way that, like one of my favorite things is to put an audio rate signal into the linear FM and an envelope into exponential FM to do those kind of soft form and vocal-like tones. And because you can do that with linear modulation, it's a much softer effect. It's almost like a very subtle color over a quite normal filter sound. When I do that on other filters and I have to mix the envelope and the audio rate into exponential FM, it's a very different kind of sound. I'm going to pull an image up. So one interesting thing that I kind of wanted to bring up, because I'm sure a few people have noticed it, is this kind of first line on the website representing the cutting edge in modular analog voltage controlled filter design. Filter rate offers more possibilities and higher fidelity in 12 HP than ever before. That's a really bold statement.
Well, it's a module I have put so much time and effort in, and I'm also quite confident. Like, I mean, this goes way beyond anything that's currently available. So it sounds bold, but I think I can get away with saying it.
Yeah, I think it's a valid point. I don't think it's an untrue statement. It's just a bold statement. Just while we're talking about kind of tones and chords and topologies, Jim in the chat room asked, what makes the Roland tone particularly? Is it the less distortion or a more steep roll off? I was just saying they tend to be, although you'll know way more than me about this, 12 dB per octave response, I think, for most of the kind of vintage Roland.
No, I think most are 24, like in the Jupiter series.
Yeah, I'm thinking like SH09, 101.
Yeah, I'm not sure. The 101 has, I think it's one of those SAM chips, which is different again. Yeah. I would have to, SH09, I'm not sure even, I would have to check. So I'm more thinking about the Jupiter series.
Okay.
Those have the 24 dB OTA filters. Well, you have two main components really. So you have the actual filtering, the integration, and that can be done in different ways. So you have integrators built around OTAs or VCAs in the case of filter rates. And then you also have the feedback. So the feedback, you take the output, you put it back into the input, and this is your resonance. and both of those are combined to make the sound of the filter. So really, you can they interact, and like they both have a lot of influence in how the filter sounds. So in the case of filter 8, like the actual integration parts are just normal VCA integrator circuits, but the resonance is completely different from anything, as far as I know, from anything that has ever been made. So this really gives it a sound of its own, and you can quite clearly tell, like you turn up the resonance, there's no decrease in low ends. You sweep the cutoff, and you can really hear those harmonics beating more than in other filters. And this also because the low end is retained, so it all comes together. So you could say, like, okay, yeah, it's a VCA filter or an OTA filter, like so many others, but then the resonance is different, and this makes it a completely different kind of filter.
Yeah, yeah. There's a nice, I don't know if it's a thought or a Pat suggestion, or if they mean anything specifically in the chat room, but Refractalus just mentions here in the live chat about how it make nice stereo effects, having all those different outputs. I think that's a nice patch, and I don't think that's one I did in the demo, but if you were to patch, if you decide which side you want to be slightly brighter and patch them hard left and right, maybe take the 2-pole output to the left and the 4-pole output to the right, you're going to have a slightly brighter left. So it's going to seem like it's slightly panned across. Or you can do some nice, interesting effects with a high pass and a low pass in both sides. It kind of gives this swirling around your head effect sometimes in headphones. Mixing the phaser and the band, and there's a lot to be had just patching them hard stereo. It's interesting when they're not totally hard left and right as well. You can create some interesting stereo images with all of those. Just because we've another question, well, we mentioned in the chat room, have you tried the Mum Mate from ALM?
No. I don't even know what kind of topology it is really, so I'm not sure. I've seen it, but I haven't really looked into it.
It's based on the S950, one of the Akai samplers.
Right, yeah.
I haven't tried it either, so I can't comment specifically. Yeah. I imagine there's probably a quirk that gives it its own tone, being from that Akai sampler. So yes, sorry to Eldo in the chat. I can't answer anything on that one either. I mean, tonally, yeah, you can totally patch whatever you want from the filter 8 itself. Looking at the manual and thinking of the different responses, here's the different responses. So we can see down near the bottom left there how the different poles of low pass respond. We've got it's nice that the high pass is a 1-pole output. I don't think I've seen a 1-pole high pass on any Euro filter, analog filter anyway.
Yeah, possibly. Maybe you can get 1-pole with some of the voltage control TQ modules.
Yeah, I guess so.
But yeah, I find that high pass filtering is an interesting effect, but it tends to be a bit too harsh.
Yeah, exactly.
When you add resonance, it can get really... So 1-pole is just a nice, smooth, way more musically useful response, I find.
Yeah, I really like it on drums, where going into a break or a transition or something, you can fade out. I like to fade sounds out with filtering as opposed to with level control where I can. And it's nice just to take out the low end, like you said, without it kind of harshly cutting out all the lows really quick and the bass drum disappears too fast. There's then the kind of unique boost and notch response, which is this one. Yeah. Where did that come? Like it says there, at high resonance settings, you get wave folder type sounds. What led to that response?
Well, the interesting thing is, so okay, I had the idea to make an 8-output filter, and you put it into self oscillation, you get 45-degree shift, and There have been some other filters which do this, but they do it by just inverting the low pass outputs. So you can see the first 4 outputs are low pass, 1, 2, 3, and 4 pole, and
Yeah.
each pole shifts 45 degrees. So it creates a 45-degree delay, basically, of the signal. So you get this phase shift for every pole, 45 degrees. So that gives you the first 180 degrees. Then you need the next 180 degrees to get your 8-phase output, your full set. So the easy thing is to just invert the low pass outputs. But I decided, like, I mean, you have those inverted, and that's useful if you use it as an LFO, but they're useless basically when you use it as a filter, because they're just inverted low pass outputs. So instead, I looked at pole mixing, which is a technique used by some filters. It's not that common in Eurorack, it appears, but for example, the Oberheim expander had pole mixing, and you just mix together the low pass outputs in very specific ratios with the input signal, and then you can create different responses. So that's how the bottom outputs are created. Now the additional challenge here was to select 4, because you have so many options. So select 4 which would be useful, and also select 4 which would resonate at the correct phase. So it was sort of a lot of mathematical analysis and some trial and error to find 4 useful responses which would resonate at the 225, 270, 315, and 360 degree marks. So yeah, the bump boost plus notch, I just tried a lot of different responses. I simulated them, I analyzed them, and I found that, okay, this is an interesting one. It resonates at 270, so that's what I needed for the 6th output. And I liked how it sounded.
So what came first, the idea of 8 phase outputs, or the idea of 8 different modes? Or was it that you had the 4 modes for the 4 low passes and you wanted to expand? Was one more important than the other, or did one come before the other in terms of design?
No, I think simultaneously, and just looking at what already exists in Eurorack, and just thinking like, okay, how can I take this further? How can I combine different ideas which already exist into one module? So yeah, simultaneously, basically, yeah.
Yeah, because the only other multi-phase output would be, well, I think, was it the Mankato? Was that the first design? And then the Dr. Octature, I know, has been brought up in several forum threads about this before, as another 8-stage output thing. Quite different in sound and definitely in design as well, the Dr. Octature anyway. So was that an influence? Was it looking back at the Mankato, or?
Yeah, I would say Dr. Octature is definitely one I looked at. Of course, I have no interest in cloning what's already out there, but I realized, okay, yeah, those bottom 4 outputs are just inverted low pass outputs, which are useless when you use it as a filter.
Yeah.
Maybe it can be useful in some crazy patch, but usually they're going to be useless. So okay, yeah, I mean, let's do pole mixing. Let's take 4 interesting pole mix outputs, use those as the bottom outputs, and you still get the same 8-phase operation as an oscillator, but you also double the amount of useful filter responses. And you get, I mean, low pass. Okay, most filters are low pass, but especially in modular, it can be really interesting to have more options. Like on just a simple analog synthesizer, it makes sense to just have low pass. But in modular, you usually want to go a step ahead in sound design, and then you need some other responses too. So yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking of let me catch the name. Refractalus mentioned when we were talking about, he brought up the patching 2 outputs in stereo and creating stereo images. He mentioned that running them, the different phases out into the left, right, mid-side, left, right from wrong electronics would be interesting. And I was just thinking for stereo effects, it's quite interesting to filter them in different ways. Say having the band output on one side and the phase shifted on the other, or the phase shift and the band boost and notch on the other. There's a lot of really interesting effects to be had, and scanning through those as well, putting multiple outputs into some sort of crossfader or 2 VCAs and invert your modulation so as one goes up, one comes down. There's lots of potential. You can do some really complex, almost wavetable like things if you put, say, 4 outputs into a mutable instruments frames, or make noise Rix mix, or any of those kind of complex scanning devices. You could do it with a mix 3 actually. You could patch up what those modules do with your utilities. If
yeah,
you into the mix.
One of the demos on SoundCloud is basically that, with mix 3 and scanning between outputs. So yeah, I've done it using mix 3, and it might be a bit better if you use linear VCAs and you have more than 3 channels. But yeah, you can do it. Yeah,
it's an interesting effect. I mean, everything, it's kind of hard for, I'm trying to think of, you know, what next, which little bit of this module do we talk about next, because it does kind of everything you can think of. It does, in that there's exponential and linear FM. It tracks volt per octave really well. It oscillates across a full range, nice even response across the outputs. We can saturate the inputs. There's the ping input, which is a technique that I think people hear about, and it comes up quite often as to what that actually means. Pinging a filter is kind of like how the 808 bass drum circuit works. To dumb it down, really, I can't talk about the circuit to any kind of really knowledgeable level, but with an oscillator that is very near oscillation with its resonance high, but not quite oscillating, you fire a short trigger in, and this voltage excites that circuit that's near oscillation to produce a tone. And that tone, because it's not fully oscillating, will just die away. Like it could be a bass drum sound if it was low, or some sort of pure little sine wave that decays away. But you've put a ping input on there. So you can just throw anything into it and it just deals with it. A bit like how some low pass gates have a strike input. It just already kind of conditions itself to ping the filter really well. I mean, where did that come from? Do you like pinging filters personally, or was it just a case of you realized that you could do this? Or
well, I think filter ping is an interesting technique, and I think the best analogy would be like throwing a stone into a pond, and you just like you excite the water and you get these ripples and they die out. That's basically what happens with filter ping, but electronically. Then like the cutoff would be like changing the viscosity of the fluid, so you get low frequency or high frequency oscillation. And to mention specifically the ping socket on filter 8, this was a suggestion by one of my testers. So I have a few testers I communicate with about concepts, designs, and yeah, he literally said like, put a ping on it, and I went, okay, yeah, that's a really good idea. I'll do that. So yeah, and I'm happy I put it on there because it's very useful actually. Not just on audio rates, but also a low frequency. You can use it to trigger sort of like LFOs that die out, I guess.
Yeah, it's almost like if you well, I guess it's exactly the same, but the technology is different. If you were to lower the pitch of, say, a bass drum, just a sine wave decaying bass drum, so low that it becomes an LFO, it kind of does that. You kind of get this wobble that then just decays away. It's almost like a one-shot LFO, I guess.
Yeah.
A strange envelope, if you will, or it's quite nice to ping it with an envelope, but send the same envelope to the FM input, so it excites the thing happening, but the rate changes over the course of the ping. That's quite a nice little technique. A question specifically about the ping, ATK in the chat asks, is the ping input a gate to trigger converter for the VC input?
No, not for the voltage control. It doesn't influence the cutoff in any way. So normally how you would create filter ping is you set resonance to almost self-oscillation, and then you excite the filter with just a short trigger basically through the inputs. So just give it this little bloop, and then it responds by going like this. And it's basically like having a little transient generator built in, or a little. It's like an envelope generator set really short to create a really short blip to send through the input of the filter. So there's no influence on the cutoff at all. So you can do what you can do your suggestion of using an envelope to trigger the ping, and then the cutoff separately. And this can be really nice to create kick drums, things like that.
But, another question from the chat, Jacko Grayshire or Grayshire. Do most filters invert the signal on the output, and does the filter rate do inversion? I mean, it's your design, you can tell us, but the phase inversions are on the panel themselves. I'll pull that up while you answer that question.
Well, all filters are going to influence the phase of the signal. So it's on the front panel, basically. Those are the degrees of phase shift at the filter frequency. So if you have a very low signal, a very low frequency, it's not going to be influenced at all. If you're at the filter frequency, it's going to be shifted by 45 degrees or 90. So let's just take a look at the one pole first. It's going to be shifted by 45 degrees. And then at an infinitely high frequency, it's going to be inverted 180 degrees. So you can't really answer that question really, because a filter is going to, like most people think of filters as just influencing the frequency content, the harmonic content of a signal, which is true and which is what we hear, because human hearing hears frequency components. But filters also influence phase, and the difference is that phase is a relative thing, and phase we can't hear. We can hear changes in phase, because changes in phase also correspond with changes in harmonic content. But phase on its own, no, you can't hear that. So I guess the question is, it depends, the answer to the question. Yeah, but if you look at just straight from inputs through outputs, you'll see that, like, if you have something going up and then down, and you look at the output, does it also go up and down? You'll see that the low pass outputs are they maintain the direction basically of the signal, and most of the bottom ones will invert. I'm not 100% sure which one do what out of the top of my head, but that's also to get the correct phase shifts on the bottom output. Some had to be inverted, some not. So yeah.
That's good to know. I mean, I realized that it always influenced phase, but not quite, to the degree that that you've explained. My circuit knowledge is more minimal than that. The comp is an interesting switch. I think it's because it's effectively level compensation when they're oscillating, so all outputs retain an even level, and that addresses that issue of multiple outputs on a filter. You set them all to oscillate, and their levels are usually quite a way off from each other. Was that just a case of you realized that was potentially a problem and chose to fix it, or was that part of the topology or the original design? Again, I think that's the only filter with that switch on, the kind of gain compensation.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, I believe, but I might be wrong on this because I didn't design it, but I believe Dr. Octuture has a secondary resonance mode. And if you engage that, you get all the outputs are the same amplitudes. But they do this, I believe, by feeding the resonance into the different pole inputs. So it's quite complicated. For filter 8, I realized that okay, yeah, this might be a problem in some patches. And again, this is a natural result of how filters work, because the filter frequency is literally the point where you get a 3 dB drop in level. So if you would look at the outputs and you measure them, the low pass outputs, you're going to measure 3 dB less on every pole. So the first one is 10 volts, and then you have 7, and then you have 5, and then you have 3.5 volts. And the pole mixing ones are basically all over the place. Because they're pole mixing and they're going to do their own thing. And so normally everything is fine-tuned, so you get unity gain, or as close as possible to unity gain, because again, filters are going to influence the harmonic content of a signal. But it's like a unity gain baseline, basically. So if you look at the filter responses, you'll see that the zero line is basically unity gain for all of the outputs.
Yeah.
But of course, if you put it into self-oscillation, they're all going to be at different amplitudes. So I wanted for it to be able to be used as a multi-phase LFO. And then you normally want all the outputs the same strength, the same amplitude. So I just put on this compensation feature, and it's there's on all the outputs except the 4-pole bandpass, which doesn't need it. But the 7 other outputs, they have a switchable gain stage. To engage the compensation switch, this changes the gains of all the outputs. Most are boosted, except the band boost plus notch, which is actually attenuated to get to 10 volt peak peak. Now, the interesting side effect of this is if you don't engage the compensation and use it as an LFO, you get 8 outputs which are at completely different amplitudes, which can be useful actually. So you don't need an attenuator; you can just take another output. Yeah, so it can be interesting to just try disengaging the compensation and getting different results.
Yeah, I'm going to find the bit from my demo video. I do show the difference in gain compensation being on or off in that video, and you can see, the waves are either all compensated to the same, or some are lower than others. I'll see if I can find it and pull the image up, because I showed it on the Mordax data. A question from God, this name's hard to pronounce. Apologies if I get it wrong. Shtick Kicker or Shtickiker just says, not opened the manual yet, but just wanting a description of the hold switch if we've not discussed it already. The hold switch, it's like the hold that we mentioned on Select 2, in that it freezes the core, whether it's audio or CV, and it will just hold whatever voltage. So there's a lot of interesting kind of almost downsample type effects you can get. Again, not something I've ever seen on a filter. So in a more clarified way than I said, where's the hold switch come from?
Well, it's really 2 things. It's a hold switch and a hold gate input. And where does it come from? It's just something I realized would be interesting in a filter, because you can't. It's an oscillator too, and it's interesting to have sync on an oscillator. but you can't put sync on a self-oscillating filter. Just technically impossible. So what other options do you have? Well, you can hold the different stages basically, and that's what the hold switch does. Now it's not really holding like a track and hold. It's not like select 2, which will just hold a voltage for a really long time. It basically switches the filter to the minimum possible, to the minimum frequency it can do in the audio or the low range. So if you have it on audio range and you engage the hold, you'll see that it still oscillates at a few hertz. So it doesn't like go straight to 0, but just as much as possible. Now the interesting, it has 2 main applications really. So if you use it as an LFO, you engage the hold, all the outputs freeze basically. And this can be really interesting as a bit of performance thing, like you have some modulation going on and you can enable or disable it without getting these jumps. Like if you would just have an LFO and you put it through a gated switch, you get it goes to 0 and then it goes back, so you get a jump. And otherwise you would need to have separate track and hold module, which I guess could be select 2, but now you can just do it in a filter. So the other application is in audio rates, and then you would use the inputs normally. You can just have any signal going into the hold input, so it can be an oscillator, and you can do hold modulation basically. So it's an alternative to frequency modulation, where you hold and not hold the filter core at audio frequencies. And you have really nice demo of it in your video. It's a different kind of modulation than the frequency modulation.
Yeah, and I should say for the videos and other videos I've done for the Joranalogue products, and I say it in the video, there's no hiding it, I am just pulling a lot of the patches out of the manual, because the manual's great, so why not, why wouldn't I make use of it? There is an example. Of course, everyone can ask questions here. I'm not saying don't ask questions, we won't talk about these things. That's exactly what we're here to do. But the manual was a really good read. Things like how to get it to be a saw wave oscillator when it's really a sine wave when it's oscillating. Again, something I did in the video. And we can come to that kind of wave shaping with feedback. But yeah, it's right there in the manual, the whole modulation idea. I really like the bottom part where you're saying that if the hold signal is a pulse wave, if you modulate that pulse width, you get a different kind of depth to the hold effect. That was an interesting one as well, and one I don't think I actually did do in the video. I've just found on the video demo the part where I demonstrate the gain compensation. So just for anyone that wasn't totally clear on that, so you can see the different outputs on the data screen, the different colors there. Some of them are going higher than others, so that's without gain compensation. And then when I hit play and flick it in, you can see even though these different phases for the outputs are slightly different, they're all the same peak voltages. They're all the same level. I just wanted to show that. I thought it was a nice example with the data. It's super useful for that kind of thing. So the hold, I mean, tonally, you said in the manual that the hold, when you're modulating it at audio rate, kind of between linear FM and sync. The nice thing for me is that unlike analog FM, you don't get any kind of weird pitch drift at high depths of modulation like you do with higher exponential FM. So it was a really nice way of just injecting another tone into the filter, or just rhythmically cutting it out. I think there was a patch later in the video where I just sent a random gate pattern to it that was less frequent than my main rhythm that was going on in the patch. And it just cuts the sound in and out. And if you do that rhythmically and your gates are timed right, you can get some interesting kind of almost like chopping up, cutting of the patterns. So that works really well too.
Yeah, it can be kind of mute switch really for the outputs at audio rates, because you engage the hold and it slows down all the outputs. Normally, if you would switch off an output, you get a little click because you get a sharp edge when it goes to 0. When you engage the hold, it just, like if it's going like this, it just continues flat, and you get a lot less of that click. So yeah, it can be kind of a mute feature too. And of course, it works in filter mode as well as oscillator modes. So it's kind of if you look at it as an oscillator, it's kind of the sync inputs, with the difference that while a sync only responds to rising edge, the hold also responds to the pulse width. So you get additional tones basically by changing the pulse width. And the inputs can be really anything. So it doesn't have to be a pulse wave. It can be a sine wave, and it's going to basically it internally creates a square wave out of it or a pulse wave out of it.
Is that just a comparator on the input, like a gate input on an envelope? It just waits for a certain voltage and then high, and then when it goes below, it's low again, and that's it.
Yeah, it's a Schmidt trigger, to get a bit technical, and this means that it's only triggers high when it goes above 3 volts. And once it's there, it'll only go low once the input goes below 2 volts. So you have this 1 volt difference, and that's hysteresis. And this just makes sure it's always clean. Even if you have a really slow sine wave going in, you don't get any in-between zone where things get a little weird. It just always either goes high or low. It's the same on the pink input also. So and that's also part of my philosophy of, I don't want people, if they're using my modules, they're patching away. I don't want people to get stuck on technical details. So I want to take care of all those technical things while I'm designing the module. So if you're using it, it just works basically. You want to do something, you'll probably be able to do it, because hopefully I've thought of it and I've optimized the circuits to make it possible.
Yeah. You mentioned a few times testers, and I think obviously your own knowledge and use and kind of range of ideas, but also the testers that you use. I did do a little bit of testing for this, but it was like finished by the time I tried it anyway. I'm not trying to claim that any of the ideas were mine, none at all. It came and it was there. It was great right away. But I think the fact that you test it and you speak to people, and that there's clearly a lot of thought and idea and kind of analysis of what's out there. Like you said, it's not in any way an effort to clone anything, but it's, you know, what cool things does this offer, whether it's the circuit or a patch technique, and just a way of getting them in there. Things like having a coarse and a fine control. When you're just sweeping low pass filters, the fine control, it's not, I mean, it can be useful at higher resonances, but for me, I don't touch it. But when it's an oscillator or an LFO, I absolutely do touch it. And it really is quite crucial that you've got some level of fine tuning. Possibly the most important case for that being when it's an oscillator. The fact that, you know, you've got exponential and linear FM, and they're attenuverters, and you can make sure that the linear FM is only AC, you can block out DC signals, modulation over resonance, which again, you don't always see. It's on a few things, but it's not a really common feature. And 2 inputs. There's no level control, but I only use the second input when I want to drive it quite hard. I tend to mix several waves before filters anyway, maybe a sub and some noise and a saw wave or something. But what's the 2 inputs, do they just sum together at unity, which is why they drive so much?
Yeah, that's it. So just 2 unity inputs. Those are mainly there because I just had some space to fill in on the front panel, so I decided I mean, I realized that having two inputs on a filter would be really useful in a lot of patches. And it's a really easy addition to the circuits. So it just looked like a perfect way to fill in that corner of the panel. And yeah, it doesn't have input level, mainly to keep the size down.
Yeah.
I mean, I could have used one of those little trimmer pots you see on some modules, but I don't use those for reliability reasons.
Yeah.
So I only use like big metal potentiometers. And yeah, then you would need like two pots really for both of the inputs if you have two. And I decided it would just be better to not keep the module as small as possible, and usually you're going to have some kind of level control in front of it, or or it's coming from a VCA from some, I mean, patches. You have the standard subtractive patch of VCO, VCF, VCA, but really modular allows so much more than that. So I don't think modules should be expected to really always sit in that classic patch. So and also part of the philosophy of keeping, like, a filter really should influence the harmonic content of a signal and not its amplitude, I feel. So you have other modules like Mix3, which does the amplitude thing, and then the filter does the harmonic alteration thing, and yeah, so it's part of different, it's combination of different things really coming together.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really nice patch to be had, putting a VCA before the filter, especially if you're using both inputs where it's going to drive, because the level that you hit that filter with is effectively like the overdrive amount or the saturation amount. So if you have a VCA before it, it allows you to influence the tone before you then start to do the actual filtering. I pull up Mix3 just for anyone that doesn't know what we're talking about, that's joined the video slightly late. I tend to like mixing three things into a filter. It's usually a saw wave, a square wave sub, an octave below, and a little bit of noise. Now, being able to, say, patch different LFOs into three VCAs or the three channels on Mix3, so that my sub level, my main saw wave, and the noise are all fading in and out of each other, but then also to be able to use the main level, maybe with like velocity from a keyboard or some kind of stepped random, to periodically over time shift how much level I'm sending into the filter, means you can get this great morphing animated thing from really basic waves, but then also choose how hard you hit the filter as a kind of distortion amount. And then you've of course got all the filtering on top. So I'd kind of, anyone wanting to exploit the two inputs, or even building a feedback path, if you want to take one of the outputs back into the input. I did that in the video demo, and you can really get some interesting screaming full-on feedback. But if you just put some level control before it, there's a lot of nuance and subtlety to be had as well. Yeah, different question about events, but based on timing, it's a relevant one. Refractalus asks, are you going to visit the Dutch Modular Fest at the end of September?
Yes, I will.
Simple answer, yeah.
When it was still the Ginkgo Modular Fest.
Yeah.
So I was there also, and yeah, I hope I'll be able to bring some new things along. But no promises on that regards.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I am going to ask you about new stuff in a bit, but you can just flat out say, I'm not revealing anything yet. You don't have to tell us anything, certainly not in this live stream. Not that anyone asked, but I won't be able to make the Dutch Modular Fest. I would have loved to. If anyone watching is at the Barcelona Modular event, I will be there next weekend, this coming weekend, from the 7th to the 9th. I believe it is. There might be some events earlier than that as well. But there's a lot of great events, it seems. Certainly the Leeds one that I hold, I'm obviously biased, but that's growing year on year. Dutch Modular Fest seems to be getting bigger. So does the Barcelona one. The Tokyo Festival of Modular seems to be getting bigger year on year. Obviously, Superbooth is the kind of holy grail of all these events and the big one for the modular world. NAMM and Music Messer seem to be having less kind of relevance, just while I'm thinking about events. I mean, for you, which events do you tend to try to get to? Obviously, Superbooth is the big one. Are there any more local to you, or do you try and get around Europe a bit?
Well, there are these small events in Brussels from time to time, organized by Shakmat Modeler and some of the other people, Clavis and so on. So like the Belgian manufacturers, basically we get together once in a while. And then I guess from bigger things, well, there was a Belgian Modeler Festival last year, but not this year. So I'm not sure how that's going to pan out in the future. But I guess the Dutch Modeler Festival would be the biggest. I'm hoping to get to one of the UK ones in the future, but it's like, you know, the travel and the expense, and you want to, like, I'm a bit too rational about this, I guess, and I look at it as an investment of time and money. And if I'm not certain I'm going to get return on the investment, I'll usually decide to not go. But
yeah, I'm the same. There's so many events and so many great people running these events that I'd love to just go and hang out with. But for me, well, it comes down to a few things. When I always get asked why I don't go to NAMM. Well, let's even take away the expense of getting over to the United States. But even to get to the European ones, I've got to factor in what work I will lose that weekend for not working for 2 or 3 days. So that's expense number one. The actual cost of getting there, eating, staying somewhere, flights, all that kind of stuff. There's no certainly for me, there's no direct money really, unless I sell ads like I do at Superbooth, but that would be harder for the smaller events. There's no way to compensate that cash. So before I even try and think about making money, as you say, there's quite an expense. And then you've got to think you're away for 3 or 4 days, which would be amazing. It'd be great if we could all hang out more often through the year, but it's not going to pay the bills for any of us. So yeah, I'm the same. I'm quite rational about it. I would love to just kind of fly around all year to all these different events, but it's just not really possible. Andy Morris in the chat said the Dutch Modular Fest isn't free, apparently. No, it's not. It's ticketed. I don't think it's expensive, though.
No, I think 15 euro or something. I'm not sure. You'll have to check the website, but it's not huge. And you have all these interesting performances too. So it's not just a bunch of manufacturers making noise, but it's also actual music going on in a separate room. So yeah, I think if you're in the neighborhood, I think it's really interesting to check it out.
Yeah, I'm just quickly looking on the site. There's some lectures, there's some DIY stuff, there's performances. There's a lot going on. Well worth, you know, whatever it costs. I don't remember thinking it was expensive when I did look. So yeah. In terms of what's to come then, what will we see from you either this year or next year? If you don't want to be specific, that's totally fine. I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but will you be continuing this, not trend, but this kind of style you set for yourself of really trying to push the functions of whatever it is that the module does? I can't see you taking a step back and doing something really basic. I mean, the modules are basic on the front. Using them is really simple. It's not menu driven or anything like that. But is that the kind of philosophy going forward, to really kind of push these designs as much as possible?
Yeah, basically I'm working towards building a full system.
Okay.
So a system, an analog system, which allows you to really look into exploring different forms of analog synthesis. Because if you look at analog synthesis, it's mostly subtractive. You have some like additive things, but not a lot. And then all the really weird esoteric synthesis modes are all digital, because there's still a lot of things possible in the analog realm. So yeah, I'm just looking to make modules which allow people to really look into different ways of patching, different ways of creating synthesis sounds, and just having a lot of options which are useful. So yeah, that's basically the path I'm on now. Getting a full system going with everything you would expect to have in a system, and maybe a bit more.
So will we,
different.
thinking about a full system then, will we see things like, will there just be a basic VCA, or will that not be needed because that's already in the mix free, for example?
Well, there's no linear VCA currently. There's no.
Okay. I mean, I'm just thinking kind of, I'm not trying to pinpoint a specific module that's coming next or anything, but we could argue that the filter 8 is also an oscillator. So if you took two of them, use the first one as an oscillator that you patch back on itself to get rich waves, and then use the second one to filter it. You could then even argue that a third one could be the modulation source. You kind of don't need an oscillator and a filter and an LFO because it's there, but do you still see these building blocks as things you'd like to have a specific kind of LFO modulation hub, a specific oscillator that maybe doesn't filter but does other things as well? Or will they be like filter 8? Will it be, this will do a, because we haven't talked about it being a slew limiter or all the other things it can do. Will there be these kind of, not intense, because they are really simple to use. I don't want to make it seem like it's complicated. Or will we see simple building blocks as well? Bit of both, I guess.
Simple. Well, I guess that would depend on your definition of simple. Like the window comparator in Compare 2 is really simple.
Yeah.
But it can be used in a lot of ways. So those kinds of modules, yeah, sure. I mean, but you won't see from me really basic things. Like I guess Switch 4 would be the exception, which was my first module, which is very much a performance-oriented module, but also something that just wasn't available. So, but really like basic things like, here's your quad VCA, or here's your, I don't know, like
dual ADSR or some basic.
Yeah, ADSR especially. I personally find the ADSR shape to be really non-musical. So it's this historical thing we've inherited from, I guess it was Moog, but I don't think he came up with the naming. But I think it was Moog who first came up with the slope. And it's just really awkward, weird, to me at least, and I think to a lot of other people too. So envelope, you need to contour things, you need some kind of changes in time, because every note has a few basic parameters really. So you have pitch, you have harmonic content, you have loudness, and you have how those things change in time. So if you look at it this way, you can see like, okay, you need some way to create a pitch, you need some way to have harmonic content which changes, you need some time, some way to make loudness which changes. So if you look at it that way, I think people can see what is missing currently, what's going to follow, but nothing which you would already get nowadays. I'm not interested in just making yet another module which does the same thing, or with one little change, or is some vintage circuit I've put into a Eurorack module. I don't think people are really waiting for that. And
Yeah.
I wouldn't be interested in designing something like that either.
There's two things from that came to mind. The first was that the only other person I've really, and I'm sure other people feel this way, I'm not saying you are the only two people in the world, but the only person to kind of put sound and music and the idea of what a note is, or an event, or a sound, or something, or a loop. In that way was Olivier from Mutable Instruments. And when people were asking him what they should get to start with, this is a few years ago, he said, you want a sound source, some kind of processor, and something to modify the processing and the sound. And you did a very similar thing and just put it in terms of what is a note, what happens. It's a pitch, it's harmonic content, it's loudness, and it's how those vary over time. And I like that. It's almost taking a step back, like you say, of all the things we've inherited. It's taking those away and just putting it in basic terms. And I think that means, well, you said it does, but it means we're going to get quite different things. Because when companies, you know, they've got a few flagship modules maybe that have created a lot of interest, and then they say, now I'm going to flesh out the system. So there's an ADSR, and there's a single or a dual VCA, and there's maybe a basic mixer and a mult, or whatever bits they make. To me, and I'm not naming names, and I'm not against people doing it. I appreciate someone wanting a system that is this person's voice. And it, you know, a synth is the kind of sum of its parts. We've talked about the filter being 90% of the sound for most classic synths. It's also how the envelopes respond and everything else. It's not just, although it's the majority, but it's not just the filter. So, and I can see why people flesh it out, but it's nice that it isn't just going to be, oh, well, I need some really basic building blocks to finish this now and make an 84 HP system or something. It seems like there's a lot more interesting things to come than that. Benjamin Izzo in the chat has put it a nicer way than I just did, but he said, you're talking about making music easier, which is kind of a nice approach.
I guess so. You know, my designs, one of the main motivations from my designs is, I guess, frustration, which would be a negative emotion to most people, but it can be really useful in design. Like you just look at what's available, or you have a module in front of you, and you just get frustrated with technical limitations, with strange things we've inherited from the past, and just I try to look beyond that and look at, okay, how can we improve on this? How can we make something like universal modules, basically, which go beyond just, okay, this is what it does, and it makes this sound, and here's the price, and go buy it. Yeah, I try to take a bit of a step back and look at it more globally. And this can be, I guess, for beginners. Like if you look at my modules for the first time, I guess it's a bit of a marketing problem I have, because they look quite simple. Like you mentioned, okay, Mix3 looks like a 3-channel mixer, and I've had this very often when people just look at it and, okay, it's another mixer. So that can be tricky to market it, but I find that people who are quite deep into modular, like yourself or other people, who email me or I meet at trade shows, they can see like, okay, there's something else going on here, and this goes deeper, and that's always nice to hear that people realize what's going on and what are the differences here.
Yeah, well, I think that kind of functions become as exciting or more exciting than the kind of next shiny new thing for people. I think you get to a point where the idea of, say, the Select 2 being able to gate on and off the level control, so either pass the signal through at the input at unity gain at its input, or it be the attenuation version that you've set, that becomes a really exciting thing, as opposed to a new distortion or an oscillator or a filter or something that someone might say is kind of sexy or appealing in whatever kind of way. It's that like magpie mentality of new shiny thing grabbing the attention. Same with the Compare 2. It's seemingly really basic building blocks, but there's a lot to be had. And the potential for kind of learning and expanding how you approach these things, I think, is quite vast on all these modules. Certainly if you were starting out and you were really intently trying to learn modular synthesis and about signals and functions, you know, 2 or 3 of your modules would give you a lot to explore, way more than, you know, another just random filter and comparator and mixer. So someone mentioned in the chat a surging Euro revamp. Now, I know you're not keen on, and you won't be revamping anything specifically or taking circuits, but it's also, it's kind of got that mentality for me. I can't help but show this just because I'm deep in the middle of really enjoying it, having picked up a Surge panel recently, and how the slope generators can be oscillators or LFOs or slews or filters. Filter 8 is kind of the same. It's just a case of, I mean, it's not one of these. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say it is, but it's, do you want it to be a slew, an LFO, audio, filtering, and each one of those is executed really well and really well thought out. It's not just a case of, well, it kind of slews, but it doesn't go low enough to do it properly. Everything is really well thought out. I'll put it to the chat to kind of any last kind of questions. I've certainly gone through everything I wanted to ask. So we'll look to sign off in 5 minutes or so. I'd love to really probe you about more of what's coming, but that's really rude of me, so I won't be doing that. We'll wait for you to show people at the Dutch Modular Fest, or when do you plan to announce it? Whatever it is that you've got coming. If not at the Dutch Modular Fest, will it be out this year, or are we talking start of next year for the next module or two?
Well, there are some other things coming later this year. So there are those little 2 HP ones I already showed at Superboots. So that's link to and add to, and those are really, I guess, they are there to fill in a system, because these are functions you need. You need to be able to add things. You need to be able to multiply multiple things. So yeah, those have been delayed because Filter 8 took priority. But these are coming in a few months.
Yeah. I should just say with these, because they're seemingly, I was just talking about, you know, kind of sexy modules, appealing modules, you know, a multiple and an adder or unity gain summing maybe doesn't seem as exciting, but, and I talked to a lot of people about this quite a lot. Chris Meyer is from learningmodular.com is a good person for this. And someone like Alan at AGH Synth as well, how a lot of buffered multiples aren't accurate buffered multiples. So to have options for ones that will be accurate and will do the job properly and reliably. You know, you see people arguing, oh, don't get a passive mult, just get a buffered one because that's what you want. Well, yeah, in practice, you know, or on paper, but a lot of them don't perform that much better than a passive one.
Yeah.
They're not created equal.
Yeah, and it's really tricky thing, because Eurorack is really not a standard. I mean, people treat it as a standard, but it's not a standard. So all the outputs are different, the input impedances differ. So, for example, on my modules, all the outputs are impedance compensated. So this means that they have effectively 0 output impedance. So you could use a passive mode to distribute CV, pitch CV accurately. But passive multiples to me have 2 downsides. The first one is the obvious one. If you have a non-zero output impedance from the preceding module and you send it through some different modules via the outputs, you get a loading effect, so you get some attenuation of the CV, and if it's a 1 volt proctive, it's no longer 1 volt proctive. So it's going to go flat. The other downside is that once you patch something in or out of a socket, everything gets shorted. So you lose everything that's connected together in the multiple. While on a buffered multiple, all the outputs have their own buffer. So that's a big difference. And this is the second thing that people rarely talk about. Also, it depends if you do live patching or not. I guess most people do in the studio, but in live situations, maybe they do, maybe they don't. But those are two advantages of a buffered multiple. Now, of course, the accuracy is a really big problem I feel with existing active or buffered multiples. So that's what I set out to. I just figured like, and that happens with quite a few of these modules. Same with Mix3. Like I look what's already there, and if I can, I would just rather buy something than design it. But if I feel like okay, it doesn't exist what I need, I'll just look at the possibility of making it a product. And if I need it, other people probably need it too. So, and then add two is, yeah, basically the counterpart to this. So you have you can mix things together. You can add them together really accurately again. Because if you use a mixer to try and add CVs, it's never going to be exact. And you can also set both sections separately to average. So that's useful as a little utility mixer. If you don't want things to clip, you just set it to average. Or you combine LFO waveforms and you retain the average amplitude.
Yeah. Things like that are really nice in front of wave shapers and folders when you want to just quickly mix an LFO with an audio signal so that you're going to create an asymmetrical, say, folding effect in a wave folder or something like that. Just nice having these small things dotted around that will just work reliably and well. So yeah, they're coming, well, Q3 it says, so I guess that's in a couple of months.
Yeah, I guess Q3 would be September, so I'm not sure if that's going to be able, it might be October. I'll have to check production schedules, and of course Filter 8 has priority, the new batch. The first batch went really quickly. There are still some available at dealers, but most of them are gone as far as I know. So second batch is in the works, and yeah, it's ready when it's ready. Basically, there are parts which are on order, and production takes time, and everything has to be tested and packed, and all the stuff. So yeah.
Do you do everything entirely on your own? I know you're not going to be hand soldering everything, but do you have any help, or is it entirely just you?
So design-wise, it's basically me, and that's everything. So that's the concepts, the circuits, PCB layouts, prototypes. Mostly me. Sometimes I get someone to do the prototype soldering. Front panel design, marketing, packaging, photography. Like it's a lot. Manual. Yeah. And then the actual production is done here in Belgium by an assembly house. And they do, like, it's just a general electronics assembly house. Probably the largest in Belgium, if not the second largest. And they mostly do all sorts of industrial stuff, so really generic. So at first they really didn't understand the module and this weird audio stuff. But it's not completely true, because they manufacture for another well-known brand of Belgian gear, which I'm not sure if I'm supposed to mention, so I won't. But
no, that's okay.
But yeah, really well known. But specifically Eurorack, no, they had no idea. But yeah, they do everything from automated assembly, so have like little circuit boards and lots of. So there's a filter, so it's quite dense, quite a lot of stuff on there. So that gets assembled, automated, pick and place, reflow, and then all the sockets and the potentiometers and so on. Those are wave soldered. So it's a really combination of automated and manual processes, like most products are nowadays.
Yeah.
And then everything gets here, and I do all the testing and the packing. So it's all still goes through my hands, and I put on all the serial number labels, so everything gets through me, which I still consider really important for quality reasons.
Yeah.
There are always some I have to reject from blemishes or some little circuit problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the current process.
Yeah, cool. I figured that would be largely the case. But that's kind of how it all ran. So what? Just kind of random, curious question, really. But what's the kind of average frame of time from an idea to the actual release, or you having the batch ready to release?
A year, probably.
And obviously, lots of overlapping ideas.
Oh yeah. So I always have projects in different stages, which also helps to retain my sanity. Like I could be working. I'm actually working on a PCB layout for a new module, and this can drive you crazy really quickly. So then it's always nice to just take a step back and look at some concepts, or just researching circuits, because I'm always collecting little circuit snippets, I call them, little ideas, little bits which can later be used in a module. If I need to do something specifically electronically, I'll have a little snippet ready to use.
That's almost like how software companies build up kind of snippets of code. And, you know, the bigger software companies have, I don't know, whatever code they're using, but they have lots of little filter designs that they can put into, I don't know, so they're building a compressor and they want to be able to filter the sidechain signal. They can just pull that code in. It's kind of like the analog equivalent of that, I guess, collecting all these little working parts that may at some point be of use.
Yeah.
Were you hit by, again, just passing curiosity from me, really kind of last couple of minutes for any questions from the chat before I just wander off down some random rabbit hole talking rubbish. But just a random kind of thought, but a curious one, because it really seemed to affect a lot of people. Were you affected by the kind of capacitor, was it capacitors or diode shortage that happened?
Yeah. Not really. Really limited. I think now, as far as procurement of components goes, the way I work is most of the kind of special audio parts I deliver to the assembly house, and they deliver all the generic stuff. So a lot of resistors, capacitors, those are diodes, those are really generic components. They usually have those in stock. And I think it took maybe a bit longer to get some capacitors, but I think for most stuff they just still have enough stock and you can still get them. So no, I mean, for now, the impact has been really low for me. There are always parts which have some crazy lead times. And a big part is also what I do is I try to design with as few different parts as possible. So if you actually look at the list of components I use, overall my modules, it's not lots. I try to really consolidate on some parts. And this just helps because you just need to have one thing missing from your bill of materials, one component missing, and you can't make a module.
Yeah, and there may be, as you say, some really crazy long lead time on that one thing.
Yeah, I mean, things like 40 weeks or something, you have to wait for something that's not out of the ordinary nowadays. So big part for me is I design something, I look at components I've used in the past, I try to reuse those, I make sure I have enough in stock, and I always check the lead times. Am I going to be able to get them? Just try to design with what I have. And yeah.
Last couple of questions. I'm just quickly grabbing a link. Cyberpunk asked when you'll release Filter 8. It is already out, but the first batch sold out. So when Joran just said it's ready when it's ready, I guess you've nothing more to add to that, that it's being built. The second batch is coming. Guess there's no more to say on that matter, right?
Yeah, of course. I'm also at the assembly house. I'm not the only client, and they have big companies they send truckloads off to every week. So I'm just this really small company, this one guy bugging them about these weird modules with those front panels. They have to screw a lot of little nuts too. So yeah, I'm already happy when I can get their attention, basically. So that's always tricky being a small company, and it's really become doing electronics on your own has really just become viable in the last 10 years or something, with the internet and all the services we have nowadays, and the cheap prototype circuit boards. Those are really, really recent things.
Yeah. Last two questions, unless another just pops up before we close out. What do you do to chill out? Andy asked that in the chat, and then Benjamin said as well, besides work, what are you doing for fun?
Yeah. Well, I try to get my work-life balance a bit more in order nowadays, because it would be a bit like the last 2 years have been a bit crazy. So I'm playing piano again now. I've taken up cycling too, which is a bit weird. I never thought I would do so. And yeah, and just anything which doesn't have anything to do with modular and synthesizers. And I don't make music. I used to, but it has really become a full-time job, and this also requires you to step away. And
yeah,
and I'll still have concepts or ideas about modules coming into my head at the most inappropriate times. I can't really escape it, but yeah.
Well, you led perfectly on to the next question, which was, again, two people asked. Frederick first said, is this your full-time job? And Omri Cohen said the same thing. He's guessing that this is your full-time job. Is that the case?
Yeah. So I basically got out of college, got my degree in electronics, and started the company right away. And that's what I've been doing the last 2 years. So
yeah, well, straight into it.
Yeah, I mean, I've been planning this for years, researching. Again, long before I had a system of my own, just looking at modular and looking at old circuits, and also repairs and servicing of vintage synthesizers, which is another interesting sort of source of inspiration. Not for circuits specifically, because I'm not interested in cloning all those old things. But sort of the how do you say it, the philosophy of those designers, especially Roland's. You look at some of those drum machine circuits, and they can make one transistor do 3 things at the same time. It's crazy.
Yeah, yeah, and like shared noise sources across all the percussion sounds and different symbols and things. Yeah, I can see how that's an inspiring thing to be doing. Like you said, without just thinking, oh, I'll use that circuit, I'll take this, and so on and so on. So I think that's it for all the live questions, and it's certainly kind of, without going wildly off topic, and there's lots we could talk about for a long time, but that's certainly everything I wanted to ask, and I think that's everything from the live chat as well. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we finish?
I'm not sure.
There was a comment.
I think we forgot to touch on the mix 3 distortion capability, because I remember you mentioned some like different kind of modules like distortion. Basically, mix 3 makes for a really nice distortion, so that's one function I also have in the system. So there are actually, if you look at what you need in sort of analog modular system, there's already quite a lot with these few modules. So it's not like I'm already planning a full series. I don't have anything planned out yet. I can't really say in some point in the future the system is going to be done, because it will never be. But I feel there will be a point where I think like, okay, now I have a system, or I have a full set, and people can really get going with just this. And then there's also the other aspect of control. And I think that's quite neglected in modular. You have a lot of focus on sound, creating sounds, modulating sounds, but it's really on playing, on actual musicality. And I think there's still a lot of room to be explored there. Now, I guess a big draw to modular for a lot of people is the lack of musicality, I guess. You can just create interesting sounds and they don't need to be musical, especially. But I sort of miss that like that Keith Emerson era of modular and synthesizers where you actually needed to know what you were doing. So I don't want to limit anyone to one specific approach to modular, but I think for the people who want to move into a more musical sort of yeah, how do you put it, sort of typical musical approach, I think we as manufacturers can serve those people a lot better than currently. Things like sequencers, and they can be quite limiting, and you can just hook up a master keyboard, but that's also really limiting because you have so many more dimensions to the sound in modular. So I think that's for the far future a really interesting unexplored region, basically.
Yeah, I think you're right with the idea of control not being explored very well, because the modular for a lot of us is the interface. You know, you want to change a cutoff or a decay time or the rate of an LFO, you just grab it, it's there, that's the interface, it's tactile, it's real, everything's there straight away, there's no menus, there's no screens. Well, there is on some modules, but generally modular as a concept, you can just grab a knob for most, if not all of your functions, depending on what you've got. But I think because of that, because it's one big interface itself, it's not a controller for a laptop, people almost forget to play the thing, which, you know, turning knobs and plugging cables in is playing the instrument as well. But there's definitely another dimension that's maybe not that explored. I mean, there's things like the Surge TKB, the easel from Buchla, other touch controls and joysticks, and there's a few bits of things. But I don't know. I think I can't think of anything specifically, but I'm sure there's more to come in that realm in the future.
Yeah.
I think you're right. It's not that well explored.
There's also, like, you know, when you play piano and you have an interface which is really well suited for that specific instrument. You have those keys, you have you have velocity, sensitivity, basically. You have those pedals, you can remove the damper, so you get sustain. And for modular, really, we just have a lot of bits and pieces you can piece together, which I guess also fits into the whole modular ideology of having bits and pieces, putting those together. But I think it for an actual interface, for a musical interface, it can be interesting to just have one unified thing, a bit like, you know, piano is a piano, or a guitar is going to have those 6 strings usually, and you know how to, if you know how to play guitar, you know how to play guitar. So I think for actually controlling modular, there are possibilities, taking in mind the whole chaotic mess that is modular. It's a beautiful mess, but it's a mess. But yeah, yes, there are possibilities there left to be explored.
Yeah, that's interesting. I won't probe you too much on that, because I think, as you said, it's this distant future. There isn't some kind of, well, as far as I know, there isn't some kind of controller coming out soon or anything. But it's an interesting one to kind of ponder on and think about. I don't think I could pinpoint exactly what I want from the interface, but when we look, and again, this is the big wide rabbit hole, me going off on a tangent that I said we'd get to if we didn't wrap up. But things like the violin took 150 years to get right, if I remember my figures properly, in terms of it wasn't always 4 strings. You know, this is a relatively new technology, you know, going back to the 60s, that disappeared. It wasn't constantly being worked on at the kind of forefront of music at the time, like instruments coming into the classical era were. So yeah, there's a lot to be had. I think we're at the, I don't think the bubble, I always get asked, is this bubble of Joranalogue going to burst? Has it grown to peak and is it going to disappear? And I really don't think it is. I think the core scene is growing, and it's still such a great community and scene that even if this kind of wider bubble of general interest through semi-modular and things like that maybe disappears in a couple of years, if it's not as trendy or popular amongst the masses, I don't think it's going to go anywhere. It might reach kind of commercial peak, and there's potential for saturation like any kind of thing. You know, music's heavily saturated now. Making sample packs is heavily saturated. Making library music is heavily saturated. I'm sure module makers are starting to feel it, that have been around for a couple of years, that it's maybe changed in the last year or two. But yeah, I don't think the bubble's going anywhere. So I'll say thank you to everyone in the chat. I put the link to my video in there. I'm obviously going to self-promote myself, but that goes through a lot of what's in the manual with some examples. The manual's great. I'll put a link up to the website. Be sure to check out the other products, not just the Filter 8. There's a lot to be explored. And as I said, if you're watching live and you have a question, or you're not watching live and you just want to ask something, leave a comment. I'll either ask Joran directly or I'll answer if I can. So yeah, you might see you at the Dutch Modular Fest for anyone that's going. I'll be at the Brafaco event this weekend if anyone's watching this before next weekend. Lots of videos to come from me this week. Cheers. See you later.
See ya.